got to stop and profile like never before. Like never before. To be the man, you gotta beat the man. And I'm saying, woo, right here. Here I am in a suit that costs more than your house. And I'm talking to you. You keep your mouth shut. The world heavyweight champ. Why don't you give it to him one more time?
All right, this is our YouTube exclusive We Want Flair podcast. All of the segments from the Fight Game podcast rolled into one YouTube episode, except for this one, we had to cut it into two parts. It was just too big for the file size that we're using here. So for the first part, you will hear John and I together talking about Flair leaving WCW. You will hear Big Dave Meltzer talking about Flair, early Flair Hogan 91 in WWF, and then also bringing in Brandon Draven from the Kayfabulous Lucha Brothers, who talks about one of his favorite matches ever, the Ric Flair Royal Rumble performance of the ages. So that'll be part one, and then we will connect in the in YouTube via the playlist. You will see it part two, and I'm not going to do an intro there, so it'll just pick up where we left off for part two. Enjoy.
How about this?
What is that?
This happens to be the real championship belt.
That's not Hogan's belt, Brain. I know the champ's belt when I see it.
You're right. Comparing this belt to Hulk Hogan's belt would be like comparing ice cream to horse manure. Comparing the men that wear these belts would also be like comparing ice cream to horse manure. You see, the man that owns this belt is right now under contract to another organization. But in the very near future, he might be coming to the World Wrestling Federation. The man is also a very long, dear, personal friend of mine.
Does the guy have a name?
Yes, he has a name. This man not only has challenged Hogan on numerous occasions, unanswered, may I add, but you want to compare him, fine. Then let's compare Hulk Hogan to Ric Flair.
All right, we're back to do the final segment of the show. This is our first We Want Flair for Ric Flair, Randy Savage, which is essentially the telling of the story of Ric Flair coming to WWF in 1991. If you heard the two We Want Flairs that we did in January and February with the Tatsumi Fujinami matches, we told that whole story of Flair getting super frustrated with Jim Herd, with WCW, with Dusty. And that leads us here. So if you haven't heard those two, I would say, give those two a shot. They're up on YouTube, on our YouTube channel at Fight Game Media. And it really leads us into this time frame. So this moment is, I would say, as a kid, so I am 15, I am so religiously watching wrestling that it's probably ridiculous. Like, my parents probably were like, what the hell is going on? And a part of it is because I was getting the inside juice that we talked about from Dynamite D from Slammers Wrestling. And also because I was invested with both companies, and, I was trying to watch as much TV as possible, and the TV that I was gone for, I was taping on video. And, think about that, right? Like taping an hour of Superstars of Wrestling, or the WCW Power Hour, or Worldwide. Like, that was just kind of like appointment viewing TV for us. So as far as I'm concerned, this is probably the time where I spent the most part of my life watching weekly wrestling. What about you?
Oh, same. I was watching everything, any other syndication stuff, their main stuff. And this was unbelievable what was happening. I remember where I was at. I was in we had an office room with a TV in it, and that was our little room where the kids can go and watch TV. And that's usually me at the time. And I remember it was Sunday. It was a wrestling challenge. And I clicked on to watch it, and there's Bobby Heenan with the World Championship, WCW World Championship, or the NWA World Championship, the Ric Flair's big gold belt. And I was like, what the hell? I couldn't believe it. Like, I was shocked. Like, I think I was just stunned all day. And so I was all in. Like, I can't wait to see what's coming up next. I had to watch everything. And so I will never forget that day. And it was just like a quick, like, okay, I'm going to watch, Wrestling Challenge right now. Turn it on, click TV. And I could not believe what I saw.
It was one of those things where, we were also both Pro Wrestling Illustrated kids. And you'd always talk about dream matchups. They would even have dream matchup tournaments in Pro PWI. And this was always the one, Hogan Flair, going all the way back to like the mid 80s. It was always Hogan Flair. And we finally had the opportunity to get there. So I'm going to go through all of the information of how he actually got to WWF and what happened and why. And as I talk through this stuff, I want you to chime in on the things that you remember, or that are as I'm rekindling these memories for you. So we're going to August of 1991. So he has not signed with WWF yet. He has left WCW. He was fired July. We talked about the Great American Bash with Lex Luger and Barry Windham on the February We Want Flair. So, fast forward a little bit, and good old JR is the one who's got speculation on his 900 number hotline about what's next for Flair. So the early speculation in August of 91 was that he may show up at SummerSlam. And if you remember, that was the show where Hogan and Warrior tag teamed with Sid Justice as the referee, the match made in heaven and the match made in hell. There was a rumor that Flair was going to show up there with the championship belt and challenge Hogan. Ross reported it, said, just made sure that, this is just speculation, but this is what I've heard. So he's still under the one caveat, or the one thing that, why this couldn't happen, is that he was under contract with WCW until September. So if he would have showed up on that show, he would have had to get out of his contract in some way. And, probably WCW is not really going to help WWE at this point. So the consensus at the time is that if Flair were to go to Titan or to WWF, recognized as the NWA champion, that his match with Hogan would be just this box office extravaganza. And you got to remember, like, wrestling in 91, when you're coming off of years like, especially for WWF, like 88, 89, even 90, business is pretty good, but it's kind of going down in 91. It would get really bad in 92 and 93, really bad. But, so a pick-me-up of any sort in 91 is sort of really, really good. And you got to remember also, Hogan was gone for a lot of the time. I think he was filming, he's at the summer of 90, he's filming Suburban Commando, right?
I believe so, yeah, or Mr. Nanny.
Mr. Nanny might have been the one after that. So, he from, I think it's from WrestleMania 91, with Slaughter, he takes a little bit of time away, even though he's the champion. And, or maybe it's after SummerSlam. There was a time period, I think, after SummerSlam where he's like not working very much because he's doing other stuff. So this is leading into this time period. So, but the other belief is that if Flair was just to go and be another WWF guy, then it wouldn't be that big of a deal. It was really like the belt that would have catapulted the business. And so that was a big part of it, which was Flair comes with the NWA belt. That really means something. And if he just comes in as another guy, it probably is not going to mean as much.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the belt was what grabbed your attention right away. I'm surprised. I was thinking, now you brought up SummerSlam 91. Maybe Flair couldn't be there. And I'm trying to remember this. I mean, SummerSlam 91, I only remember a few things. I remember what was the best match was Bret Hart, Mr. Perfect, right? That was like the best match. I remember Warrior leaving in that middle of that tag match main event, and Hogan alone beat up Slaughter, and Mustafa, Iron Sheik at the time. Or he was Colonel Mustafa at the time, but the former Iron Sheik. What if they would have just had? I don't know who was doing play-by-play. I don't know if Bobby Heenan was doing play-by-play then, but what if he wasn't? And as Hogan's doing his whole pose down, some music hits. You're like, what the heck is that? Interrupts Hogan, and out comes Bobby Heenan with the belt. Mm-hmm. Gets in the ring and then tells him then, the real world champion is coming. Ric Flair is coming or something like that. Or maybe you couldn't say Ric Flair, but maybe you just say the real world champion is coming. And everyone,
that would have been awesome.
I always back then I was in shock, right, when I saw him Wrestling Challenge, but I always would look back in hindsight, his debut wasn't as amazing as I think people were probably remember, right? I thought it was kind of flat. I mean, even we'll probably talk about his first appearance on television. I remember it was kind of like a weird feeling to where the setting was, and it just didn't seem right at the time. Maybe because it's just Ric Flair on WWF television for me, but it just didn't. I remember at the time it wasn't. Looking back when I watched that footage again, it didn't feel as man, they could have done a lot better job with this.
So the to your point, I think if you're Vince and you've been spending all of this time as the number one promotion and never talking about the other promotion, I'm sure that crossed his mind too, right? Do we want to give credibility to these other guys, and would it actually help their business if we talk about this thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why he did it with the angle of being Flair as a fake world champion, right? That's what Monsoon would always just call it bogus, and he'd always, Monsoon was the voice of WWF. This is ridiculous. He's bogus, and this and that. And then they would censor the belt. Remember, he had to carry the tag title around. It was just. I think they never said the words NWA. Only Bobby Heenan and Ric Flair said the real world, and Mr. Perfect, I guess, would said the real world champion. Everyone else was calling false.
Yeah. So the show that I mentioned, I've mentioned this before, kind of the impetus for me even wanting to do this show was in the last week of July, I went to a show at the Oakland. Back then it was called the Oakland Coliseum. Today it's actually going to be shut down, but people would know it more as actually not shut down. I think they're using it for other stuff, but people would know it more as Oracle, where the Warriors, won their championships. So they would WCW would usually run the Kaiser Arena, which is a smaller building. And then WWF would run the Oakland Coliseum Arena, or whatever whatever they called it back then. And this time WCW ran the big arena in Oakland next to the Alameda County Coliseum. And so that's the show that I would have gone to, which was originally supposed to be Flair and Luger. And it went and became Luger against beautiful Bobby Eaton. And that's the show where the whole night, everyone was just chanting, "We want Flair," the whole night. So Dave says the house was 3,800 people. And so that building can seat I don't know, 18,000 or something like that. So less than 4,000 were there. It felt even smaller from my memory, but that would have been the show. And WWE ran the Cow Palace up against this show. So in middle of August, more information is coming out about what's going to happen with Rick. So WCW learns, and how did they not see this thing coming? They all of a sudden go, wow, if Rick may go to WWF. And so they try a last ditch effort and they offer him the book, which is so weird to me because they had just brought Dusty back to book. So can you imagine the headaches there? I guess you would have to say sayonara to Dusty, right? Like what would happen?
Well, it's funny because he stopped booking WCW because he couldn't handle Jim Kerr's BS. So if Jim Herd's still there, like, why would they think that would be something that would put it over the top to make him like want to come back? Like, no way. I think he was just done. He was done with WCW at this point. He was ready to go and prove himself again in New York and for Vince and show WCW up. And, he did a great job at that. And when it came to, his matches and stuff, but as being a valuable player, but yeah, it's so funny that, now they want him back. It's just what a slap in the face. No way he was coming back. I don't think, unless they gave him like maybe like $500,000 or something like that. Or something.
Well, we're going to get to that in a second. Mm-hmm. So like you said, in August, the Bobby Heenan teases start happening. Big Dave reports that the speculation at that time was that Flair and Hogan would work a major house show run in the fall rather than hold off the program until WrestleMania the following year. That's actually exactly what happened. And so later in August, one of the PR guys told a Detroit newspaper that the first Hogan-Flair confrontation would be on Survivor Series in Detroit. So that was actually told to a newspaper by a PR guy. So you could see like things were not concrete as far as what they wanted to do with these guys. So Dave also reports that other people in Titan, that's what he calls WWF, like forever until probably, I don't know, once we got to the 2000s, he should call them Titan, would have indicated that Flair and Hogan would start their house show run as early as October 18th, with the first matches being in California. But based on TV ratings, it appears Flair will work with Roddy Piper for the time being. I'm sorry, not TV ratings, TV tapings. Work with Roddy Piper, but that's probably until Hogan returns from doing the movie, which I'm assuming is the Mr. Nanny movie. So there was a TV taping in Rochester. Hogan does an interview talking about Flair, and then Heenan did an interview with Flair's title, which wound up with Roddy Piper doing a run-in. And this gets Piper out of his short retirement because he wants to work with Flair to get Flair ready for the Hogan stuff. And it sounds like... it sounds like just that the plans are changing. Like they're trying to decide whether do they do the Hogan Flair stuff at this time to, rejuvenate the house show business, or do they try and hold it off until WrestleMania? And today, in the way that wrestling works today, you would hold it off for that big match. But WrestleMania back then wasn't sort of what it was. Like they didn't really hold off stuff because the house show business was so much more a big part of their annual revenue. And so, to them, like this was the way to go was to go to the house show run, because you could do so many houses in a row. You could run it back several times and it could draw. Whereas WrestleMania was just one show that you would do that with.
Yeah. And then, 91 wrestling in the United States was down. Business was down, for both sides, WCW and WWF. So, them making the call for Flair Hogan on the house show, a lot of people were always confused about that. Like for a business standpoint, that was the best decision they could make at the time, because they needed to get increases those houses, and what's going to increase those houses the first time around is being Hogan and Flair.
And so Ric Flair officially signs in early September. Dave speculates that his Nature Boy nickname would instead be changed to The Champ. Thankfully, that didn't happen. Mm-hmm. Contract is believed to be a 2-year deal, but no financial guarantees other than the standard guarantee of income from television appearances. So this is so interesting to me, because you think about how free agency works today, right? And maybe to Vince McMahon's thing, he's like, well, Rick really doesn't have anywhere to go. He can go back to WCW, but they screwed him. Where is he going to go? There's no other place to go. Is he going to go
Japan? He could have gone.
He could have gone to Japan, but it's not like he was going to go to the Indies and do stuff. So it definitely seems like Vince had the leverage here, and he also understood Rick really wanted to stick it to WCW, so that takes a little bit of leverage away from Rick too. And what you said earlier as well is just this willingness to want to prove himself.
Yeah. That's one thing I admire about Ric Flair. Like he always wanted to be the best. And when his value was questioned, it motivated him. So I always took that as, I always respected Flair for that. He always seemed motivated to be the best as best he can, even when he got older and he had to take a couple extra shortcuts here and there. But I mean, he still had that mentality, like, I need to work and I need to be the best out there. And I need to put on a 110% performance, even though, he was like 50 or, he's out there, he's out there trying to hang with Orton and Batista, these young kids, and partaking in some extracurricular activities to get some muscle himself, but he just, he's a wrestler and he wants to prove his value to the company. And so I always admired him for that. He's just that drive to be the best.
So in Rick's own book, here's how he explains signing with Vince McMahon. He says, I went up to the World Wrestling Federation's office in Stamford, Connecticut to meet Vince one-on-one. We talked money and I told him what I'd been earning in WCW. Vince said, I don't give contracts, but I'll shake your hand and tell you that you'll make more, you'll make the same with me or more. He had another guarantee that if I was ever used as anything but a headliner, I would be free to seek employment elsewhere, even WCW. There was one obstacle in the way, and I told Vince about it. Herd had finally broken through to me, and WCW wanted a final meeting. I felt that I owed it to myself to at least hear their other offer. Then I get right back to Vince. We shook hands, and Vince looked me in the eye. Is your word good? Yes, it is. When I shake your hand, Rick, I'm taking you at your word, and you're taking me at mine. Rick says, finally a professional. And then as soon as I got downstairs, I called Arn and said, I think I'm going to go with Vince. And he goes on to say that Arn is super frustrated because he just had come back to WCW himself.
Yeah.
So there were Dave reports that WCW took one last ditch effort to re-sign Flair. He was going to come back as a babyface and oppose Lex and have a hand in the booking, but not be the booker. And they wouldn't meet because I'm assuming that was after.
I'm guessing that just means creative control, somewhat of creative control.
Sure. And I'm assuming this was after Rick had already shaken with Vince. But according to Rick in the book, he said 3 years for $2.4 million was the offer that he never got back to WCW about.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's pretty high for.
That's pretty high. That's pretty high. Yeah.
I mean, it was Ted Turner, so you could imagine that maybe Turner's gonna.
What if it was Ted that talked to Rick the final time? Would have
better than Herd?
That's what I'm saying. Like, I think that's who they needed to get. They really wanted to make sure Flair doesn't go to New York. I think they should have, brought in Big Ted and Jane and took him to a Braves game and talked us out.
All right, so Flair finally makes his debut on Superstars of Wrestling. You'll remember this for the air date of September 28th. He lays out Vince with the chair, the accidental chair shot. Mm-hmm. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. But I thought his first appearance was Primetime.
Yeah, I meant wrestling appearance.
Oh, in ring. Okay, yeah. I just, do you remember that Primetime
one? The Primetime one was like 2 weeks earlier, I think.
God, that was so weird because in that weird studio where the fans are sitting down and that, that fake. It's like how that weird Primetime studio they went to and Vince is in the workout jumpsuits and stuff and and then out comes from the side of the sideway and he comes out in his black robe, and there's Ric Flair on WWF television. And I remember, like, of course, being like just shocked, to see that as well. And then, but looking back, like going back and looking at the stuff, when I was, like about 10 years, 12 years later, I remember being like, man, I wish it would have been a little bigger than just this little studio with 15 fans in attendance.
So actually what happened is I think Piper's trying to hit Flair with a chair, and then he hits Vince on accident, and Vince does a stretcher job. Yeah.
That was shocking. That was extremely, extremely shocking and exciting. And I was, I was hyped for Piper Flair just because, I didn't see that stuff. Obviously, I wasn't watching wrestling in 1983 and all that stuff, or even before, the Mid-Atlantic stuff. But like, I saw like the Starcades and I know Piper was there, so, and I remember reading the magazines, the PWIs, and the histories of what happened before where I started watching. And I remember being extremely excited to see that matchup and to see Piper and Flair, for my eyes, in the WWF ring. And they had some great matches too.
So he does it looks like a several night run with Piper, and then his first singles match with Hogan is scheduled for the end of October at the Oakland Coliseum Arena. And then he and Hogan are going to do a few more matches in LA and in Arizona. And then he'll work Madison Square Garden, but against Piper and not Hogan. That's the tentative plan. And we are in mid-October at this point. So Flair and Hogan advances are very strong, but the Flair and Piper advances aren't as strong. So it's pretty clear what the WWE audience wants to see, and it's Flair and Hogan. They're not, they're not too interested in seeing Flair as, they don't see Flair as a big draw without Hogan at this point. So it's so funny because remember, it was only, it would have been that summer that Sid comes over and he's the big get, right? Like he's the guy who's the big get for WWF. Sid tears his bicep right around this time frame. And who do they use to work house show matches against Jake? They're trying to get Randy Savage back. And Savage at this point, obviously coming off of that 91 WrestleMania 7, he retires. He loses the retirement match, wants to start the family with Elizabeth, is off of the stuff. And they're trying to get him back. But Randy Savage has leverage, right? Because he's a wanted man and they want him back. They're losing Sid. They need someone to do, the B towns or the non-Hogan towns, I guess. And so they're trying to get Savage back. So this is also the time of this famed Sid Vicious, Brian Pillman, Mike Graham squeegee story that happens. You remember that one?
This is where he goes in and starts beating up. Was he threatens someone with a squeegee? Right? He threatens. Is it Pillman or?
So I guess WWE and WCW were running the same town, and Sid walks into a bar, and it's all the WCW guys. Brian Pillman and Mike Graham are hanging out, and Sid's got the injury, so he's. He doesn't want to get in a fight, but he's bragging to those guys about, life is so good on this side. And he basically says to Pillman, you'll never be a big star because you're not, you don't have the size. And so Pillman's frustrated and, Pillman's ready to fight. And Sid's like, nah, man, I'm injured. Come on. I'm not going to waste money, getting hurt. I'm already injured. And so he leaves, he bails out. And then he comes back and he's like, now I want to fight. He's got a squeegee in his hand. And Pillman just snatches the squeegee out of his hand, and then it's pretty much done.
Yeah.
So Flair is calling himself the real world champion. Like you said, Bobby Heenan was calling him that. And they're trying to get that belt back because the belt is now on WWF TV. So Flair's side is like, look, pay me the money that you owe me. You can have the belt back. So the first Flair Hogan match actually happens on 10/22. So it wasn't the Oakland Coliseum Arena match. there was supposed to be, there was a TV taping on October 22nd. Flair was supposed to face Piper, but because Hogan and Piper were about to do a short run, they wanted to try the match out. So instead, Hogan faces Flair in a short match in Dayton at the end of a TV taping, and they try the match out before they take their show on the road there. So that first match is 10:25 at the Oakland Coliseum Arena before 14,900 fans. Not a sellout, but Big Dave reports that it's the largest wrestling crowd in the building in a couple of years, even with a very bad undercard. They dusty finish the Oakland match, and Flair uses a foreign object to pin Hogan, and then the second referee comes and they reverse the decision. Isn't there like some grainy footage of the finish of that show from like a handy cam out there on YouTube?
Yeah, I'm actually know the gentleman that took that footage, Peter Hines. Peter Hines was a cameraman, friend of these kind of like, I guess it would be like a backyard company. They would do like, it's called Extremely Strange Wrestling. There's like Insanely Strange Wrestling, but they are Extremely Strange Wrestling with J.R. Benson, who was a manager at APW, Ron Head, who was a ring announcer for APW, and they were like these weird group of dudes. And actually, we saw, you were there with me at the J Cup show in San Francisco, but I saw J.R. Benson after. I haven't seen that guy for 20 years. I don't know, something like that. And I saw him, and he's like one of his first wrestling. He lives in like Sacramento, and it's like one of the first wrestling matches he's been to live in a long time. So they had they used to go around, and Peter Hines like had a camera. Was one of those guys that had a camera attached to him. And we had a camera, everything. I mean, he's around ABW just filming stuff, random stuff. Who knows if I'm on stuff, And I'm sure I am with the audience stuff. And he was the one that filmed that match, that Hogan Flair match from Oakland.
So Heenan goes out on the road with Flair. Heenan is a retired manager at this point because he's had so many neck injuries from all the bumps he was taking back in his day. But Vince wants him to go out on the road with Rick, probably also to make sure Rick's not getting into trouble at the same time. But Heenan's neck is really bothering him, and there's a joke in Flair's book. Heenan writes that he just can't keep up with Rick because Rick wants to drink all the time and stuff. So Heenan comes off the road, and everyone remembers that Mr. Perfect replaces him. But there was a time in there was a time frame where Heenan was off the road, and they didn't have a replacement. So I didn't know this, but Jimmy Hart actually took Heenan's place for some of these matches.
Yeah, I remember reading that too, and being like, wow, that was weird. But yeah, Heenan, and then comes the executive consultant or something like that. His title was Mr. Perfect, was to Ric Flair.
And who do they really want for that spot?
Not Jimmy Hart. John Tolis? No, no. The coach. No, I don't know. Ooh.
Cornette.
Wow. And they could have had him too. 1981. I mean, I'm sure
he turned it down.
I'm sure. Wow, he turned it down because he's starting Smoky Mountain, right? He was getting plans for that going. Yeah.
So they come back with this match in the territory.
That would have been money, man.
It would have been crazy.
Gosh.
They come back 3 weeks later in the territory to the Cow Palace, and they don't even do half of the business at the Cow Palace. So that match drew the first time, didn't draw as well the second time. Mm-hmm. But part of that reason is because they did an experiment, and I guess this is the match you do the experiment with, which is the only advertising they did for the show was the TV. So the local TV, that's the only advertising they did for the return of Hogan and Flair. So they didn't do any newspaper stuff. They didn't do the radio stuff. They didn't do any other TV stuff. They literally were like, okay, we're not going to spend the money on the advertising, and let's see what the house is. And the house was way down.
Yeah. Oh, go figure, right? I mean, yeah, that was a big mistake. Definitely.
So the Savage Jake the Snake angle with the Cobra biting the arm stuff happens right around this time. Very memorable. We've talked about that on this podcast like a couple years ago, probably, that whole angle. And so finally, there is the Survivor Series is coming up, and there's word that there's going to be a second show a couple of nights later, or maybe almost a week later, called Tuesday in Texas. And the first thought, or the first information coming out of that the show was actually to have Hogan and Flair in the main event. Obviously didn't happen that way. So like you said, Perfect becomes Flair's manager. Around this time, WCW takes WWF to court. WWF agreed that they will not show the real belt. They are instead going to create a replica belt. And then WCW was like, well, no, like it just looks the same. So that doesn't help. And that's when they started doing the tag belt, and then doing the black circle over the tag belt. Yeah.
Jack Tunney's ordered that he's not going to show that belt anymore, and they're going to block it off from now on, which was I always thought was a bummer.
So we get to the Survivor Series. Rick is in the opening match with the Mountie and Ted and the Warlord on his team. He does get his own entrance, but very quickly Rick is doing he's doing all of his Ric Flair stuff, but doesn't look strong almost the entire match. But at the end, he outsmarts everyone and doesn't get counted out or doesn't get disqualified or whatever it was. And he's the lone survivor of the match. But if you were someone who didn't watch the NWA growing up or WCW, and this is the guy who comes in, he wasn't booked strong at all, really. And, you know, it wasn't really his character anyways, but also just kind of looks like a WWE guy.
Yeah. I remember being a little disappointed. I think this was one of the better matches on the show, but at the same time, disappointed in how he was presented. I thought they should have just had him and Piper be a special singles match on this show.
Yeah, why do you put him with all those guys?
One of the most bizarre things during this early run of Ric Flair and WWF is him in that interview with these guys around him. You had the Warlord as Phantom of the Opera. You had a guy from the Mountie from Canada. And, you know, and it just looked so goofy at the time. And I remember being so taken back by it. And it was very jarring. But, you know, they went on. The match was entertaining. And he had some good people to work with, like Davey Boy and you know, Piper, of course. But you know, Flair's always been, as a heel, he's a giver, right? So he's bumping on the ring. That's his style. He's never been like this dominating heel wrestler or champion or whatever. He was, you know, that's not his style. So, and it's a different style than what is presented with the WWF's time, where, you know, they're bigger guys or big monsters compared to Flair. So I would say to a fan that didn't watch WCW or NWA, they would probably think, who's this guy? You know? And I think that was the idea, like, cause at the end, like he survived, but he also like kind of like collapsed, you know, and then like is like down and like, this guy's, you know, this guy, he's claiming he's a world champion, but we know he's BS and they're saying he's BS, but you know, but they're trying to tell us something different.
Look, as a Ric Flair fan, I dug all of it because I was so entertained by it. But if I put myself in the shoes of somebody who was so WWF at that time, I would not have been impressed with him coming in. Yeah, like, this is your first showing of like, this is the guy. And then he just sits there and takes clotheslines from Davey Boy Smith and, you know, gets beat up by, I don't know, hopefully he didn't get beat up by Virgil. I don't exactly remember, but
I'm sure he gave Virgil some stuff for sure.
So the main event, or actually it was in the middle of the show, but the real draw for that show was Hogan and Undertaker. That match was terrible. But Rick comes out at the end. He slides a chair underneath or into the ring so that the Undertaker can give Hogan a tombstone on the chair, one that Hogan said gave him a neck problem. And supposedly Undertaker was like heartbroken over that he actually hurt Hogan until he watched it like 10 years later and was like, this dude's head didn't come close to the mat.
Dude, like his head was like by his belly button. That's how far it was. And I at the time I had, this is the same era of my life or time of my life when I was giving my friend Chad Ing VHS tape pay-per-views for me, so I'd watch the next day. So I'm sure Mr. Ron Ing was really upset at me again, but he loved me like a son, so that was great. He's a little pissed for 3 hours, but
his TV, man,
TV was I know, and I remember because in the pay-per-view show, they just show it clearly. It's like clear as day. Like his head gets nowhere near the chair. But I don't know. I'm sure you watch this on the network. I don't know if they edited that down or what.
No, I just watched it.
So they have the original. So they have the original pay-per-view broadcast. So that's very cool. I mean, not cool for new fans getting into it and they're gonna call BS on it. But yeah. I remember that this match wasn't the best. Definitely. But I think they had a better match at Tuesday in Texas.
The match was better at Tuesday in Texas, but there's also some really sloppy moments. Like Hogan throws Taker into the ropes and he just like collapses. Like he almost like kills himself running the ropes.
Well, yeah, it snapped on him. Yeah. Like, he hit it wrong and it snapped on you. And that's usually very dangerous. I mean, people can really get injured with that. And and his gimmick is he's dead. So you can't be like, oh, damn, or show any kind of pain. And that probably hurt like a son of a bitch. And it did hurt like a son of a bitch. So,
okay, so Flair helps. The Undertaker beat Hogan for the WWF title. They run it back 6 days later, this Tuesday in Texas. And Hogan wins the title back. Flair tries to interfere again, but Hogan beats him up and wins the title. But because of Paul Bearer's interference and Hogan hitting Taker with the urn, the title gets held up and it will be decided at the Royal Rumble, which is where we will leave everybody. But I did have one more quote that Rick had for his book. Rick, he has a lot of respect for Vince, that's for sure. So, in his book, he says, during a tour of Japan with Beth, I called him, meaning Vince, about a critical tax problem. I owed $200,000 to the IRS. When I arrived home, the money was there, despite the fact that I was working only on a handshake. Simply, Vince came through for a guy he believed in. No notes signed, no guarantees asked. It's a shock that as soon as I entered the World Wrestling Federation, my crippling anxieties evaporated. And as I predicted, Jim Herd got canned in the fallout from the incident. I'll have a large pie with pepperoni, please.
Awesome.
All right, bringing on Dave here to talk about Hogan and Flair's first match at the Oakland Arena. I guess this would technically have been the second match of the run, because I was reading in the Observer that Flair and Piper were supposed to do a match at the end of a TV taping in Dayton, but then Hogan and Flair kind of wanted to have like a practice run, I guess, and so they decided to have a short match in Dayton before the start of the actual house show tour.
Yeah. I mean, Oakland was always billed as the first match. It was Oakland, Los Angeles, and I think Phoenix might have been the third one. But I remember Oakland, Los Angeles, because those were the ones where we did the gate, like we did a poll, whatever it was, like a contest to pick the attendance in the gate for, and a lot of WWE guys were even in on it, even Patterson did it. As far as like pick attendance and pick the gate for the first two nights. It was Oakland and Los Angeles. And Oakland was almost sold out, but not completely. And Los Angeles was, it was in the 12s, if I remember. It wasn't as big as I expected.
So the match itself, there is a handy cam version of the match. It's not great quality, but I think it's by the person who recorded it is Roy Lucy. How do you
Roy Lucier?
Yeah,
Okay.
he's the one. I think he put it on YouTube. So the match. Do you remember the match as far as quality?
It was really good. It was what you expect from a Hogan Flair match. I mean, it was. But yeah, no, the crowd heat was tremendous. And I would say, I remember thinking it was going to be 75-25, and I would say it was more 85-15 in favor of Hogan as far as the crowd reaction. There were definitely Flair fans, but less than I thought there would be. And, but yeah, it was, Flair was a super worker, and Hogan, Hogan was real motivated. It was the first one. They didn't go as long as Flair wanted. I remember that because I talked to Flair that right after the match, and it was just like, I remember him telling me, it's like, I want to do 25, and Hogan says we're going to save 25 for WrestleMania, and I was thinking in my head, you ain't going to get to WrestleMania. That's never happening. Hogan's just saying that because he didn't want to go 25.
So the in reading back in those observers, the idea before the feud was that whether or not, is this going to be the explosion of the house show business and professional wrestling in general that is necessary or is needed because, it was the decline. It was definitely on a decline from the years prior. And you wrote that while the shows had done better than just about anything in recent memory, they weren't, I guess, this record breaking business that some thought it would be.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't like all sellouts or anything like that. It did, business was down at the time, and it did pick business up from this like September, for a couple of months. By January, the advances were bad, and that's when Vince pulled the plug on it early. But yeah, and it was weird too because I would say that the fans were more excited than management because I do remember being told, and I think it was actually Patterson who told me, and it really hit me that, just like about a week before, and he just goes, it's going to do real well. He goes, it's not like if it was like Hulk Hogan and Undertaker, and I was like, nah, you know what? This is bigger than Hulk Hogan and Undertaker, but, they didn't see it that way because they're in their minds like, nobody knows who Ric Flair is, you know what I mean? And as it turned out, because the crowds kept dropping, what it was is people did know who Ric Flair was, but because it wasn't promoted as anything special, it fell off. I mean, it fell off great here. I think that they went from, what was it, almost 14,900 to maybe 5,400 the next month, which just stunned me, seeing how empty the second one was.
Well, you had written that they decided to experiment with cutting back on the advertisement for the second match, and it was just the local TV, and like they didn't run, I'm assuming, what would have been the newspaper ads and the radio ads, but they, like, I'm not exactly sure why they decided to do that experiment, but. And then the result was that the Cow Palace show was way down from the Oakland Coliseum show.
Yeah, I was stunned going to the Cow Palace show. And it's like this Hogan and Flair's second meeting after a hot first meeting with a DQ finish that led to a viable rematch, and this program's supposed to be hot. And yeah, it was shocking to me, the crowd at the Cow Palace.
So then heading into the Survivor Series pay-per-view, the idea that they were going to have the Survivor Series, and then there was this secret Tuesday night in Texas. In before they actually figured out what they were doing, there was some thought that Flair and Hogan were actually going to have a match on Tuesday in Texas. I think it was you had sort of refuted it like after like the next week, but Flair is kind of just another guy in the Survivor Series, and he gets his own entrance, but he's just thrown into the Survivor Series match as like, oh yeah, this is the real world's champion, and we're just going to put him in the opening match on Survivor Series.
Yeah, I thought the build to Survivor Series is what killed the feud as being anything special, because to me, the Hogan Flair thing, what made the Hogan Flair thing big is that Flair wasn't a WWE wrestler, and I thought that was really important to try to portray it as he's coming in, it's not a WWE guy, and they wouldn't have any of it. And I thought as another guy in the WWE, he's quickly going to come down to earth, because it just changes the dynamic of everything. I mean, he's still a star, he's still Ric Flair, but it's just different than the money was NWA World Champion, NWA's face of the company for a decade against Hulk Hogan, and then when it became was Challenger of the Month. And Challenger of the Month, he did better than the Challengers of the Month were doing. But it wasn't, it wasn't the turnaround, like that legendary thing, champion versus champion, whatever, that type of a thing, which rarely would happen. It wasn't that special thing. And Hogan and Flair should have been that special thing, because, it isn't even just champion versus champion, but it was decade-dominant champion versus decade-dominant champion that people debated on, and, you had all those strong emotions about, and people still cared about the world title back then compared to now. And, and again, I was at the show. Oakland was so hot. I mean, it's not like it was special hot, even more than a regular Hogan match, a lot more. But, by November, it was just the Hogan match. Maybe, and it was a stronger challenger than usual, but it's still just the Hogan main event.
Now, the idea of Flair coming in as, I think a lot of people obviously knew who he was, but for those loyal WWF fans who were so pro Hogan, that, the idea of Flair coming in and doing the Ric Flair style, which is, taking everybody's offense. It wasn't like the monsters that they would bring in, like these humongous guys that Hogan would have to sell for and then do the comeback. This was like, if you were like, didn't know a lot about Ric Flair and you watched him bump for everybody in the world in that Survivor Series match and then the Royal Rumble match, he's a champion because he's very savvy and crafty and smart, but that wasn't like the type of challenger that Hogan would usually face. And he didn't wrestle like a strong style. I don't actually remember what the house show, the TV matches were. I think he may have only had a couple of them where he beat somebody with the figure four, but it's not like he was this like strong guy coming in. He was doing the same Ric Flair style, which is to win in the end or to be crafty in the end, but pretty much get beat up for the whole match.
Yeah. By the time the Rumble came, Hogan and Flair was dead. It was a done issue. They were doing tags. It was Hogan and Piper against Flair and Sid. And the big heat was Hogan and Sid. The other guys would have set it up. But like I said, Survivor Series was the one where, and again, Vince pulled the plug, whatever it was, 6 weeks later. I remember watching Survivor Series and going like, okay, Flair and Hogan. They got a couple cities they haven't gone in. It's still Flair and Hogan. It'll do okay. Like Boston still did well and all, but it was definitely the bloom was going to be off the rose for that exact reason. Flair should not have been bumping for anyone. He shouldn't have been wrestling anyone but Hogan at all. I know he worked a lot of house shows when because Hogan didn't work a full schedule when Flair did, so he worked a lot with Piper, and he beat Piper. And I guess that's okay because Piper rarely lost, and Piper was a big star and all, and they had shot the angle and all that with Piper. But, as far as like being on the teaming with three WWE guys against, that was what it was. He was teaming with a bunch of WWE guys against a bunch of other WWE guys, and he was just a guy. I knew that was going to take the bloom off the rose, and it did. And, it's one of those dynamics that I thought it was very obvious, and it was one of those things where like they couldn't think that way, because they're just incapable of thinking that way. It was like the more he's on our TV, the bigger star he becomes, and it's like actually the more he's on your TV, the less bigger star he comes. But they couldn't figure that part out.
Well, one last thing, John and I always we've thought about this. You mentioned that Heenan has to go. They put Heenan on the road, but Heenan's neck is too messed up, and they eventually move over to Perfect. But there was you had written that Jim Cornette was actually the one that they wanted to replace Heenan, but I think that was right when Smoky Mountain was going or whatever. So Cornette decided not to do it. But do you think that would have worked to, maybe kickstart some of that stuff again if Cornette's the one in the corner?
I think if Cornette was able to do the interviews that he instinctively would have done, I think it would have helped a lot. Because the one thing is for that period, I think Cornette, more than anyone, understood what I kind of said, and I don't think they did. So, yeah, I think so. I mean, Heenan still had the cachet, and he was the legendary manager and all, but, I think Heenan wished he could have done it, but he didn't want to be a shell of himself. Because I know Heenan loved Ric Flair. And, even at the end, even though he only managed Ric Flair for a short period of time, I remember Heenan would always say, like, his 5 favorite, whatever. Number 1 was always, the big 3, which was Kurt Hennig, Ric Flair, and Ray Stevens. That was like the big ones, and his favorite people to manage. And number 4 was Pat Patterson, and number 5 was Bockwinkel, which would get people all kinds of mad because everybody thought that it should be Lanza or Bockwinkel because he was more famous for managing them. But the reality is that he loved Kurt Hennig. Kurt Hennig was like a son to him, type of a thing, and. Ray Stevens to Bobby Heenan, that was just like the god of wrestling, and Ric Flair's the other god of wrestling, to Bobby Heenan. So, yeah.
All right, we're going to bring in Brandon Draven now. Draven is the only person I know who can call out the eliminations in order in the 1992 Royal Rumble, which is Ric Flair's classic match for WWF. Brandon Draven, what is up, my friend?
What's up, man? Thank you for having me on here. I haven't been on your newer podcast. I've been in the old Ball So Hard podcast a few times, which would always pop me, but I haven't been in this one. So thank you for having me, man. All
right. No, it was a perfect time. You are, as well as just being a wrestling fanatic / historian, you also know Ric Flair's story very well. So I wanted to bring you on our We Want Flair segment, and specifically around this match because you have, I've talked to you about it, and this is one of your favorite matches as far as performance and stuff. So before we get to the actual match, 1992 January. You're probably a young teenager at this point.
I'm 11. I'm 11 years old.
Okay, so even younger than that. Yeah. So what is your wrestling fandom at this point in time?
I was both WCW at this point. The typical, I guess, what anybody from my generation would be as far as being a hardcore wrestling fan. I was watching at this point WCW, WWF at the time. And I did catch Global. Global was also on our television at that time. So that was 3 that I was watching pretty intensely at the time. But this was the 92 year. I really enjoyed it because it was Ric Flair. Now I've said this before on my own podcast, is that I started as a NWA / WCW fan first, and then segged into becoming a WWF fan because my neighbors were into the NWA. So to me, Ric Flair has always been a big deal. Even I was never a Hulkamaniac. I was never caught up in that cartoon world of the WWF. Even as a kid, my favorite wrestler was Bret Hart, while he was in the Hart Foundation and getting absolutely no push. So I must have seen something in the guy before anybody else did. So I was just, the Royal Rumble 92 is always going to hold a special place in my heart for that reason.
It's actually funny you say Bret Hart, because at this point in time, there was talk that he was possibly leaving the company, and then he realized that his contract wasn't, I guess it had rolled over and he couldn't actually leave, but there was real thought that he was going to leave for WCW at this point.
Yeah, at this point, Jim Herd really wanted to, because it was looking bad that Jim Herd was losing all these guys like Sid and even like Flair a little earlier, and in the Road Warriors. So he wanted to do something where the tide would turn, right? He wanted to start getting some of their guys. And Bret was one of them. And also Ted DiBiase was another one. And both of them, for whatever reason, were locked down under contract to Vince, and they just couldn't go anywhere. But Bret got the closest. And so that was one of the reasons why he dropped the title to the Mountie a couple of days before this show. And then they had Roddy Piper come in and do that whole deal, which was classic. That's one of the biggest pops you're ever going to hear, is Roddy Piper winning the title here in Albany, New York at this Rumble. And he actually, all things considered, came out of this entire show as one of the most over guys, for the pay-per-view, because he wrestled twice and he had a great showing in the Rumble. And he had that segment with Ric Flair where he came in at number 15 when the ring was cleared. So he had a lot of promotion done towards him for this show. So Bret and Ted DiBiase, both of them were kind of, there was rumblings that they were going to go to WCW.
Yeah, it was almost like for Piper, Flair coming to WWF kind of reignited him a bit, because if I'm remembering correctly, he was sort of retired, and then when Flair comes in, he decides that he wants to be the guy to get Flair ready for the Hogan matches, and then he kind of has a bit of a rejuvenation year at the end of 91 and all the way into 92.
Yeah, he was doing the whole thing with Virgil right before this, which wasn't getting him anywhere. Just because Virgil, he was great in the beginning, and a lot of it was Piper, but he just couldn't carry the load, right? I mean, Virgil ended up kind of, flaming out after like SummerSlam 91, even though that was another incredible pop. If people want to hear a pop, watch Virgil defeat Ted DiBiase at SummerSlam for the $1 Million belt. That's a pop right there in itself. But Roddy Piper was doing commentary. He wasn't doing much. And then this opportunity came by. And then they did the angle where Vince McMahon took a chair shot, which was wacky. And then and then they were off and running with the feud. Yeah. So the first half to get them ready for Hogan.
Okay. So if you're 11, you're not really hip to the business stuff yet, right?
No, that wouldn't be until like 95 when I started in the Observer. So I was like 14 when I started. Unfortunately, I did become a quote unquote smart mark. And I say unfortunately because there's a lot of magic that's lost, as you know, when you kind of become smart to the business. And I was very young when that happened. I was kind of that first wave of the internet back in like 97, 98. But at the same time, it gave me a head start to really learn about the real history of the business. Very frustrating in some sense because you can't carry conversations at that point with other fans. But at the same time, I've always, as I got older, that I appreciate the information a little more, and so yeah. So at 11, I was just still just a fan who was just a fan,
Well, I'll tell you this quick story. It doesn't really relate to this match, but 1988, the main event between Hogan and Andre, my local newspaper published the finish the day, I think it was the day of the match. So it was like, I don't remember if it was on the sports page or not, but I do remember going to school that day and going, hey guys, this is what's going to happen. And then coming back to school Monday, I was like the predictor of I was Nostradamus to all of my friends. And so when I sort of realized where the newspaper would have gotten that information, I asked Meltzer, like, I don't know, this was probably like, probably 10 years now. Cause when did I first meet him? Like mid 2000. So this is like 10 years ago. I said, hey, I have this real vivid childhood memory of the main event being spoiled. Would you have given this information to the reporter? And he couldn't remember really, but then I don't know if you remember this. He put up I think there was 188 Observer that they've put up on F4W. And I think it's in that Observer, or it's either in that one or the one after. And I just randomly recently got like a bunch of 88 Observers. But in that thing, he writes about my memory, about the exact reporter who did it. And then how they got it. Like, I guess it wasn't even much of a secret at that point because of advertising or advertising WrestleMania 4 or whatever. So then I was like, look, 10 years ago you told me you didn't remember, and I showed it to him, and he was like, oh yeah, that had to be me.
Well, I was gonna say it was easy back in the day, because what would happen was that, and they still do this to this day. Like, these guys have the same match every night, right? They have this, and they don't change anything about it. Back in the day, because they were all just walking zombies because of that schedule, and nowadays, just because everything's so overly produced. So, if you had a match on Saturday, say in San Jose, I mean, you could go, if you're a newspaper reporter and you're hip to it, you could always say, well, that's going to be the result on Sunday. So here's the spoiler for Sunday, and they ain't going to change nothing. That's literally what's going to be the result. So you start kind of, like you said, coming off as Nostradamus. Now, the whole WrestleMania 4 tournament, that's a whole different thing.
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah. Okay, so let's get to this match. This match is great. Everyone who's watched this match loves this match, loves the performance. But what is it that made you watch it so many times and have just such the memory and the recollection? And like, what is it about this match that made you, the fan that you are of this match?
Okay, well, it was in my video store all the time. And what happened was that I would go over to my uncle's house with my dad and my family or whatever. And like any Latino family that grew up back in the day, they would literally get all the kids and throw them into one room with a VCR and a TV, and then they would go party, right? That was the whole deal.
Oh yeah.
So with me, it was, and my cousins, they'll throw us in a room. And first they would take us to the video store, and everybody got to rent one video. I would always rent this video just because I loved it. And then so I would, show up to the room, put it on, and then we would watch it. And this would happen every weekend. I've gone on record as saying that I've seen this match about 100 times, and I'm not exaggerating. I've probably seen it about that many times. And then later on, it was just something that I love, because this match is one where you don't have to be a wrestling fan to enjoy it, just because it has fundamental drama in it, right? So it's like you latch on to Ric Flair. You latch on to Bobby Heenan, which we're going to get to right now, because Bobby Heenan makes this match, this match is historic, probably thanks to Bobby Heenan for about like 70%, I would say. It's a pretty big, because the match itself is not that good. And we're going to get to that big pink elephant in the room, because a lot of people don't like to talk about that. The actual match itself, especially considering other WrestleManias that came after this, it's not really that good of a match. But it's the structure of the match that makes it important. Mm-hmm. The people involved in the match, because you have right here, both from the Observer Hall of Fame and from the WWE Fake Hall of Fame, you have probably about 50 to 60% of these guys are all in it. It's an incredible stat when you think about it. And that rarely happens, only because this match was for the world title. So they were all going to be in it, all the top guys.
Not only that, but everybody that walks out of the curtain and comes to the ring is gigantic human being. Like, you watch Ted DiBiase come out and you're like, God, this guy is so big. Like, when you watch it with 2020 eyes, right? Because everyone in wrestling today is so small by comparison.
Yeah, of course.
These guys are so huge. The thing about the quality that you just said is pretty right on, because if you watch this match without sound, and sometimes I watch wrestling like that because I'm doing something else or I'm working or I'll have it on in the background, you do see like some missed stuff. Like, you think of Shawn Michaels and how great he is. And in this match, he's like missing stuff left and right. Like, he super kicks Ric Flair and misses by like.
That's right. I remember that. Yeah.
So you're right. But this is why, we'll sort of bring it back to 2020 in a sense, why empty wrestling doesn't work, because you don't have the reactions of the fans sitting there watching, what you said is magic. And really it is magic. It's magic, and it's performance, and it's smoke and mirrors, and it's Bobby Heenan. But turning the sound down, you're like, oh, this is a kind of a fun match the way it's structured, but I don't get everything unless you turn it up and you listen to Bobby and you listen to the crowd and you listen to Flair beg off and all that stuff.
Well, even the structure of the match is what's important, because I don't know if it was Pat Patterson or whomever. You got to remember that before there's been two eras of the Royal Rumbles. There's the era that we have now, where a lot of guys come in and there's a big heat spot and a shine spot where they come in and do all their finishers, and it's literally about who's going to come out at the buzzer, right? That's literally what the Royal Rumble is about today. Who's going to come out at the buzzer, and are they going to do their entire moveset in like a minute? That's fine. That's what we have, because it creates. You stay on that roller coaster ride constantly up until number 30. before they came up with that formula, it was more about just guys trying to actually win a battle royal. So you saw a lot of lumbering guys kicking and punching and trying to throw each other out. Some guys would come in, if they were over, they would go through their moveset. Some of them wouldn't. And then within there, you had like some feuds kind of, within the match. Like right here, we had Randy Savage and Jake the Snake, which is classic. But it was very, it was kind of slow and plotting. And so the thing about this match in particular is that it was structured beautifully, working within the limitation of the guys. They had the whole first half, which is actually literally finishes at number 15 with Big Boss Man getting thrown out and then Roddy Piper coming in at number 15 and kind of starting that second half. So you don't have the lumbering giants out there getting winded and making it really boring. And then after that, you just focus on, you focus on the feuds, the Jake Roberts, Randy Savage feud. The Undertaker comes in. So you have all these great little storylines within the match. And this was one of the first times they did that because 89, well, they started with 88, but I don't really count that one. 89, 90, and 91, it's just one big battle royal. And you're coming in and you're doing your spots and you kind of start choking people and punching. Here, you start you start breaking the match down by segments. And this is one of the first time we started seeing that. Mm-hmm. And so I think it works. It works to the benefit of the match because you're covering up for the guys that can't work, like the Iron Sheiks who was in this match, like the Skinners, those like Bob Slaughter who was past his prime, and you make up for it with like the little mini feuds and you breaking down quarterly. You break it down quarterly and then you keep the action going. So that's what this match has going for it, even though the match itself as a whole is not very good.
So before we get to kind of the structure and the layout. When Flair comes to WWF in the fall of 1991, you had been privy to his run in in the late 80s in WCW. You said you were a big fan. Flair comes in. And he comes in with this, mystery belt. Now, for people who watched both like you knew exactly who he was.
I knew what it was, and I was marking out.
Right, me too. But for those who were WWF only fans, I'm sure they knew the name Ric Flair, but they maybe didn't know his style. It's just when you bring in this challenger for Hogan, it's a whole different ballgame than usually how you would bring in challengers for Hogan, which was these big, giant monster guys who are just beating the crap out of him, and then he makes a comeback. The opposite is Flair, who's more savvy. He's not strong. He doesn't, he's taken everybody's move. It was really a flip of what the WWF formula was. How much of that do you think was the reason why the Hogan and Flair thing didn't work as well as we all probably thought we could have fantasy booked it when we were kids?
I think the reason for that is a little more complex. I don't think it's as easy as A or B. I think, there was some paranoia at that time because in early 91, the Hogan and Kurt Hennig program didn't really get over, and it actually kind of flopped at the houses. Even though everything Hogan was touching at that time was turning to gold anyway, but you would want it to turn into more gold. You know what I'm saying? So saying the Kurt Hennig Hogan program was a flop is actually the wrong term. It just wasn't drawing as much as Hogan had drawn with Earthquake, before that, or some of the other big guys that he was wrestling with. So I guess you could say that Vince had in the back of his head, like you put him with a lighter guy, even though. By today's standards, both Kirk and Ric Flair are pretty big guys.
Yeah.
And so there's that, weighing on you. But at the end of the day, it's Vincent and his ego. And I've always said it. I mean, here, even me at 11 years old, here I was marking out because I saw the WCW title, the Big Goldie on the WWF screen. And it was amazing. And it was weird because what I do remember about that time is that nowadays, if you're a fan, you all this anxiety as a fan, you could release it on the internet because there's like-minded people there, right? Mm-hmm, well, when you're 11 years old and you have this very inside knowledge that you don't even really know it's inside, all you know is that the world title from WCW all of a sudden appeared on WWF television. Like, where do you put that energy? There's no way. I can't go to my schoolyard and start just marking out over it because nobody's gonna understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So it was weird because it's almost like you kept this energy bottled up, this positive energy of being a fan, right? The fandom or what the fan culture wasn't really a thing back then yet. to now where we're all connected as fans. So that was very frustrating. I remember like, God damn, that's the WCW title. Because what happened is that when Barry Windham won the title after Ric Flair had left, or Lex Luger won it, I'm sorry, they made him a new belt. So whatever, he's off doing his thing. But this was the actual world title. This was Ric Flair, who just vanished from WTV in July. Like, that was another thing. Back then, we didn't have these warnings. Guys just disappeared from television and they were gone. Yeah. So here, I think you got the Kurt Hennig thing going on. You also have the fact that Vince McMahon has an ego, and of course you have Kevin Dunn there. We've heard these stories many times, more stories even. And so I just think it was that whole idea of like, if we give Ric Flair too much power as this outsider who's the real world champion, what does that say about our title? So then you start that starts messing with your mind. And then, once they put him in that Survivor Series team with the Warlord and DiBiase and the Bounty, what do you have after that? You have just another guy in the company. That's really all you have. Yep. And at that point, fans ain't stupid, especially, back then. I mean, I'm sad to say it, but back then the fans were a little more cultured and stuff, so they understood certain things a little more, and they weren't just accepting of things. And so at that point, it's like, why? This is just another guy. And so once, we talked about the house show loop, once they came back, it showed in the gates. It wasn't drawing as much.
Well, I mean, you go back to that Survivor Series match, and the Ric Flair actually bumping for everybody's move in this Royal Rumble match works because he's like, Muhammad Ali rope-a-doping everybody. But in that Survivor Series match, it doesn't make sense for him to do that same thing, even though he wins, because what does he win in that match? He's just an opening match talent on that show, and it would have been much better usage of him to not have him wrestle at all until you get him with Hogan on a big show, and they didn't do that.
Well, the whole key here is that he should have come in as this mysterious guy that everybody knows, and again, you have to kind of walk through eggshells, right? Because you can't say WCW, and you could, but you wouldn't want to, because then you're promoting the opposition. But everybody knew who he was. So it's like the right way to have kept him was to kept him kind of like this outsider, like a legitimate outsider who was coming in and he was bragging. He had this belt that, and then if he's really the real world champion, put him in the Royal Rumble. Let's see what he does with it. Have the same Royal Rumble you had, and he wins it, and then he has the credibility to go with Hogan. Yep. But I think at this time, and at other times we've seen with Vince, he just went into this self-fulfilling prophecy of like, he's from the Bush Leagues, as Steve Austin likes to say, he and then guess what? He'll create a scenario where Ric Flair does come off as being from the Bush Leagues. So that's what happens. That's what happens when you have egos and you don't want to do what's right for business.
All right, you already mentioned the Flair clears the ring. Piper comes in at the halfway point, and Heenan gets to go off on whether it's a skirt or a kilt, and
that's
that classic line.
Yeah.
So, but what are some of the other moments that you remember very fondly about this match?
Well, again, it's the structure of this match. First of all, Davey Boy got over huge just by being number one, right?
And this is supposed to be post steroids era, because they had just started the test.
No. Because they started after Texas Tornado got caught in St. Louis, which would have been, I want to say, in the summer. They actually started in the summer of '92, I believe, or maybe, but it definitely wasn't yet. It was coming. Oh, you know what? No, what happened is that they had taken the baseline test. Right.
Yes, they had taken the baseline test.
Right. So the baseline test was done, and remember, it's in the Observer. They came back and 95% of the wrestlers were all like real high, and that's when they told them like, get off this shit. That was just to see how many people were on it, and then tell them to get off the shit. And some of them didn't listen, some of them quit. This is also when this is actually a very important show, because this is like a good delineation of like what WWE was before 92 and after 92, which was when they couldn't find their identity, because a lot of guys fucking bolted after this show, man. A lot of them. The Warlord, the Barbarian, tons of them. Those were Jimmy Snuka left. So it was just weird that a lot of them, Hercules ended up leaving. And all the muscle guys just couldn't face the fact that they couldn't take steroids anymore. Mm-hmm. But going back to what you had asked me before, so one of the again, this is like a good movie, this match, because the older you get and the more you appreciate the inside workings of the business, and you start to see all the little, what we know as little Easter eggs, right? Which has become a big terminology in movies, with the MCU and all that. So here you have a few of them. First of all, I do love the psychology of Ted DiBiase not being in the ring that long, because it tells you right off the hop that anybody's vulnerable to get thrown out. Because Ted DiBiase would always put his time in these matches, right?
Well, yeah, he would do what Flair did in this match, which is last for a long time, and it was the exact opposite. He was like the first guy kicked out, and he didn't even get to the third person. Right.
So here they're already telling you that. I also love the fact that this was, for whatever reason, Vince always believed in Shawn. Like he would bury every other small guy, but Shawn, even going back all the way to the Rockers, he just believed in this guy. I don't know what he saw in him, because he was super small, smaller than most of these guys, which is funny because now Shawn would be one of the bigger guys. But that's and so here he gets his little moment. He gets a lot of, like you said, he does miss a couple spots, especially that one with Flair, where Flair actually puts. I blame that one on Flair though, because he took the bump way too early.
Yeah.
And then he actually put his hand up where the foot made contact with the hand. But Shawn is bumping and he's trying to get over, and he does get over with the boys here. Again, there's two ways to get over here in wrestling. Either you get over with the fans or you get over with the boys. If you get over with the boys, more of them are going to want to work with you, and it's going to help your stock in the locker room, which is always also a good thing. Then you have all the guys from the NWA. That's really where a lot of the older fans now really get a kick out of this match, because the whole thing here was that everybody was coming in. There was this subtle underlying theme of the match where Ric Flair was kind of like he had the biggest target regardless of who everybody was feuding with. So literally, and it became comical as everybody's coming into the match, they're all going for Flair. So the match by default revolves around Flair. And so you have stuff like the Texas Tornado coming in after him, which it's a big Easter egg for anybody that's followed the business. And Greg the Hammer Valentine is another one that's, everybody knows their history. Roddy Piper, Savage, all these guys that he had history with in the past are all coming out there, and they're going for him. And again, there's a subtlety to it, because Gino Monsoon ain't gonna sell shit that you didn't do outside the WWE, so he gonna say nothing. So it's all up to you as a fan to kind of connect the dots. And then as a little cherry on top, we have all these Hall of Fame guys, man, and all the guys that later on became respected. So I think this is the perfect, this match is the perfect storm of all kinds of things, where it's only going to get better as the years go on, because of the legacy of the match and also the legacy of the guys in the match.
Yeah. All right. So as we get to the end of this thing, like you said, they save Hogan and Sid Justice, these bigger guys for the end, because they don't have the gas tanks and these guys. But we get to the final four. It's Hogan, it's Flair, it's Justice, and Savage.
Savage, yeah.
So, I think one of the themes of the Royal Rumbles, if you kind of watch them, especially into the 2000s, there was a thing where, okay, it's kind of the final four, and then they kind of reset. They don't really do that necessarily here, but it is a big deal that in the match, the final four are going to be the four main event guys at WrestleMania 8.
Right. And that's another misconception about the whole idea of Hogan and Flair at WrestleMania 8. It was never going to happen at WrestleMania 8. And that's one of the most frustrating things about, looking at this entire period in hindsight, because they had marketing out for Hogan versus Flair during this time, but it was part of the storyline to get you to Hogan and Sid. I mean, and also to Savage and Flair. So essentially the match was teased as part of the build-up towards the real main events, which is kind of weird when you think about it, because if that match would have gotten over, which it didn't, it would have really created havoc. But back then, nobody was really talking about it. I mean, from doing my research now, but even me, as an 11-year-old kid, I kind of accepted where they were going, because first of all, the angle with Savage and Flair was excellent, getting Liz involved. That was awesome. So that made me forget that, hey, they had just promoted Hogan and Flair. But even then, even I knew that Hogan and Flair was like whatever at this point, because Flair was just another guy. So they had the point I'm trying to make is that the final four here were always the ones that were going to co-headline WrestleMania 8, and they had the plan all along. It wasn't like they changed their mind midstream like a lot of people think they did or whatever. It's just that Hogan and Flair was never meant to be at WrestleMania. It's just the way it is.
All right, so we get to the end, and interestingly, the way that you get Hogan out is for him to get eliminated by Justice, and then he and Flair together. Well, not together, but Hogan is upset, and then Flair
Hogan's
takes
being the
advantage of it.
crybaby that he's always
Right.
been, you know.
And it's amazing that the powers that be thought that this was going to be a way for Hogan to be baby-faced in this thing, and not understanding that Sid really is the one who looks like he got screwed out of this match.
Well, they're both idiots because Sid's hanging his hand out there when he should have been focused on Flair, which, you know, as an adult now, I'm thinking, dude, come on, win the match.
It's John Studd and Refrigerator Perry all over again.
Except he doesn't decapitate himself with that lower rope like John Studd does when he takes that bump. It's so horrible. But the thing is, you know, I'm just joking, though. At the end of the day, yeah, you're right. The story is structured to have more sympathy towards Sid, and it shows in the match because everybody boos Hogan, which has been edited off the network and the Coliseum videotape. The only way to hear that is if you have the live pay-per-view version of it. But I think even at this time, maybe Vince had this subtle thing where he was done with Hogan. Maybe he was like, you know what? Because at this point, Vince ain't a dumb man at all. He understands exactly what he's doing. And he understands wrestling psychology, which is the key. So I'm thinking maybe he wants Sid to have that sympathy. Maybe Sid is I'm not saying maybe, for sure, you know, he thinks that Sid is going to be the next Hogan.
Yep.
And so that was the whole point, to kind of get Hogan, kind of start phasing him out with that heel heat, and then, you know, phase him out at WrestleMania 8 or whatever. So, so I think there was definitely some intent in that angle. I don't think it was all accidental.
Well, it also, you know, it's going to get worse throughout the year. But at the end of 91 is a lot of your Inside Editions and those kind of shows talking about steroids and talking about Hogan, and you got Dr. D and you got Superstar Graham.
Yes.
And those guys are like really, you know, trying to give away secrets, you know, on Hogan. Oh, he's this real steroid abuser forever. And so that stuff is starting. And like I said, it'll get worse. And that is part of the reason why Vince has to go away from Hogan, at that point in time. But that stuff is kind of starting. So I do wonder if it was in the back of his mind.
I'm sure it was. And one of the things that kind of gets frustrating for me as a historian, and I'm sure for you as well, is trying to kind of articulate and put in perspective to some of the younger generation of fans that we have nowadays, how important that news coverage was and how detrimental it was to Vince and the WWF, because the world's completely different now. Those kind of news edition television shows really don't have the power they once had, and they don't even I know they don't have the credibility, because a lot of them are seen as jokes. Whatever's left over today, they don't have the equity that they had, you know, 25, 30 years ago. So to go out and try to explain to a younger fan why this was so dangerous to the company, it's very difficult, because there's I can't get a perspective to connect it to today, just because it's a different world we live in. So yeah, but you're right. These Inside Editions and all these shows, they were the Geraldo Riveras. They did a lot of damage to the company, and the company, for not being honest, did a lot of damage to itself in return.
Like our moms and watch those shows, and they're like, do you see what your hero is doing here? Why is he caught up in all this stuff?
Yeah, those shows had a lot of equity with Middle America. They had a lot of equity with the soccer moms. They had a lot of equity with pretty much the entire family fabric of this country, and everybody was watching them. You know, the men would come home from work and they would watch the afternoon ones or the evening ones, and then the women would watch the afternoon ones, and they had a lot of power. And so nowadays, people laugh at that, right? Because nowadays we see them, and then later on it came out that a lot of these shows were work as well, or they embellished a lot of stuff. So, but back then, man, it was dark times for this company, and Hogan was right in the middle of it, for not being honest, man. And it was one lie that just kind of turned everything around at the Arsenio Hall show, and it got that ball rolling, and then more and more scandal came out, and it changed the company. It changed it. They were never the same until '97. I mean, shit. So yeah, that was a big deal.
And you know, you're not going to like this comparison, or maybe you will, but you know, you're a Los Angeles Dodgers fan, but you remember, you know, Major League Baseball goes through this same thing you know, I don't know, it's 10 to 15 years later with the steroid stuff. And it's not like Hogan and Barry Bonds were the only guys taking them. They were just on top while all the news coverage was at its height. And so they get the most of the blame of everyone, and it's kind of similar in that way, because you know you're on top and you're the big star, and then you almost take the blame for the entire sport in a sense.
Right. Well, as you know, with news coverage, everybody wants a black or white answer. No, nobody wants context, right? And we're still in that era today. That's going to be forever, because our brain wants an answer. They don't want context or subtlety or nothing like that, or abstract way of like receiving the information. So it's very frustrating, because even in '92, yeah, Vince could have cleaned his company up. But if WCW wasn't testing, or if even the independents, they sure as hell weren't going to be testing, or Global or whomever, if they got caught doing something bad, guess what? The media was going to just lump everybody in there, right? Mm-hmm. So it was also a frustrating time for Vince, because even he's trying to, but you know, if nobody else plays along, then the industry as a whole is still going to be in trouble. And I remember Dave writing about this all the time. He would always be like, what does it matter if Vince clamps down? It's because if we as an industry don't clamp down, then we're all going to sink together, because again, your average media consumer is not going to pick and choose. Our brain doesn't work like that. It's like it's either all the industry is guilty or none of it is guilty. And so that was another things he was dealing with at this time too. Same thing like you said with baseball. You know, it's the same thing. All
right. In closing,
except for the Astros, I blame them for everything. Major League Baseball had nothing to do with it. They're cheaters, and you know, they stole the ring from us. But that's all right.
That one hurt you guys the most. All right. In closing, talk about the promo after this match is over. You know, with Flair, it's a pretty famous promo, and I think, you know, most people who were watching at this time could probably quote large amounts of it. But was this one of your faves?
Of course, and I've quoted it many times. The tear in my eye promo. Ric Flair has gone on record as saying this was a very subtle shot at WCW because they didn't believe in him. They you know, Jim Herd had really kind of, you know, dragged them through the mud and tried to say that he wasn't good enough anymore, to the point where he's in a saddle with a gladiator gimmick. And so pretty much the tear in my eye, tonight I walk around as the real world's champion, is him saying, this is what it's all about. This is the real world champion, what I'm holding here. Not the WCW belt. This is my belt, the world title. And so when he starts running down the names of all the guys that he beat, he could only use WWE names, of course, or WWF names. But he also it was for you to kind of interpret as all these other names that he had also gone through over the years. So the metaphor was that it was all about, you know, how WCW had lost his confidence in him. He came to the WWF. He won the real world's title, the one that matters, and he's gonna go out and party. And then Gene says, "Put that cigarette out," to somebody who's smoking about 3 feet away from them.
Is there so? I didn't watch the Stone Cold Steve Austin interview with Flair, but you mentioned that it was good. Somebody told me that there's an edit of this interview that's like an extended cut that WWE cut because he mentions like Sting or something in it.
No. I've seen the uncut version on pay-per-view. I have the pay-per-view version on DVD. He's never mentioned Sting. But could you imagine back in the day?
No, that's what I'm saying.
Now here's another theory. I just watched that documentary today. None of that came out. But here's another theory. Now, if they pre-tape that, which I doubt, because he's
bleeding, right?
He's bleeding. No, he's not. He's just sweaty, and he's sweaty. Yeah. So I thought they pre-taped it. But if this person is talking about maybe they pre-taped it and then there's the story that they edited that off, that's a different story. But as far as the pay-per-view version, this is the same one that aired. Same thing.
Okay, yeah, because I need to watch that. But someone had said that
it does put over Sting in the documentary, though. Oh, okay. Or the interview. I'm sorry, the podcast, whatever it is.
Yeah. All right. No, this has been good. I was watching. I had it on in the background while we were talking, just because I want. You know, I've seen this a bunch of times, like you. But there's a moment where Sid and Rick are working together, and Rick's got his right arm. and Sid does a kip up. I think Rick kind of helps him up a little bit, but I didn't remember that. Like, you can watch this match like a bunch of times and still find stuff that I didn't realize. I didn't remember Sid doing a big kip up.
And before I leave, let me just, again, I don't think we've given credit to Bobby the Brain Heenan. This is his match too. I mean, he's out there putting a performance of a lifetime. And, you know, for the people that have never, well, I don't know if anybody hasn't seen the match, but I know you got some listeners that maybe haven't. The whole idea here is that Bobby Heenan is Ric Flair's financial consultant, right? Is that what he calls him?
Yeah.
Okay, no. So Perfect is executive consultant. Oh, Bobby Heenan is financial advisor. There you go.
Yeah, it's financial advisor.
Which is wacky. So Bobby Heenan has a financial stake in Ric Flair winning this thing, right? It goes without saying. So as soon as Ric Flair, so first of all, Gino Monsoon's ribbing him the whole night, bro. From the undercard, he's like, "Oh, you know, Ric Flair got number one, and I've got sources," and then that's freaking out Bobby Heenan, right? What do you know? Tell me that. And he's like, and then. Ric Flair. So anyway, so Ted DiBiase and Bulldog come out, they do their thing, and then the countdown starts, and then Ric Flair comes out, and Bobby Heenan has a heart attack on TV, which he sells, and not literal heart attack, more of a comedic, oh shit, heart attack, and he's bitching and complaining. He even says, and I quote, "We got job, Monsoon, we got job." That term should not exist in 1991 vernacular. You know, it's weird, but he's like, "We got job, Monsoon, we got job." And then
you know, when I'm, you know, watching this live, I probably don't even. I mean, I understand who a jobber is, but I don't understand the terminology of that, what it really would mean in the business.
Right. And then, you know, he's got some other classic quotes during this time. If you want to be fair to Flair, you go number 31. You know, all that shit that became infamous later on, and it's pretty cool. But the whole idea here is that he's kind of our vessel to the match he's our POV to this match, and it kind of adds another layer that we've never seen before or after, because he's a surrogate to Flair as an announcer. And so he's at one point he's bargaining with God. At one point he's asking for somebody to give him something with a kick, like, you know, to drink, you know, and it's just comedic gold, and the thing is that, you know, him and of course Gino's there with him, right, the whole time, just catching out his fastballs, his curveballs, his softballs, everything, just fucking playing along with it, right? And you just know that these guys didn't rehearse nothing, and that's to me is the purity of this match comes out in how like organic it is, and how like unproduced it is, and how just it's something different, and you're never gonna see that again. Because they didn't have nobody in the ear telling them, "Oh, get this over," or talking this lame language that you know only we talk in. None of that stuff. So it was awesome.
All right, you and Big D are recording more episodes of late of the KLB. I'm assuming just because we're all kind of stuck in our homes all day long.
Yeah, so we've recorded. We're like the TNA old recording schedule where they would tape all these matches and then they would put them all together and tape them up and then release them. So I don't even know what's coming out. I just know that we've recorded a lot and we're going to continue to record some more. We're doing these mini topics right now. Like, for example, I know we got the Brawl for All episode that we're recording, and also the he wanted to do this thing, and so yeah, the thing with Big D is that I gotta kind of calm him down, because I think he wants to do the thing why they shouldn't mess up Drew and how they messed everybody else up in the last 20 years. But that's not really true, because John Cena didn't get messed up. So I don't know where that topic is going to take us. I think what he wants to do is he wants to put over Drew McIntyre.
Yeah.
But I'm going to be there to reel him in, because
but you're going to counter every time that he's wrong.
Well, that's the thing that I think it's a little, you know, I love Big D, but this topic seems like it's a little self-serving, and I got to be careful with that, because we got to kind of like, they haven't really killed anybody in the last, they haven't made stars, but the ones they do believe in, I think they've done a good job. I mean, with John Cena and like Roman, there was other things. We're probably going to spend an hour on fucking Roman again, which I'm tired of that subject. But so anyway, so that's what we're doing. And just go to Google and type in Kayfabulous Lucha Brothers, and then that you'll see all the iTunes. Or go to iTunes and type the same thing. It'll take you there. And that's pretty much it, man.
I'll also put the link to the podcast page in the show notes as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
All right, man. I appreciate you coming on. I couldn't do this episode without you knowing your love of this match. So really appreciate you coming on and spending some time with us.
Cool. Thank you, man. Thanks for having me.